In the preface to Ryan Wilson and April Lindner's anthology, Contemporary Catholic Poetry, Ryan writes this, quote, "One of the things human beings are always forgetting is that the world is greater than any individual's idea of it. The world is more complex, more manifold, more mysterious than any mortal mind can fully comprehend, as is the human individual. As Henry David Thoreau once wrote, I've never met a man who was fully awake." Ryan Wilson on contemporary Catholic poetry and poetry's magnificent wake-up call now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Ryan Wilson was born in Griffin, Georgia, and raised in nearby Macon. He is the author of many works, including The Stranger World, winner of the Donald Justice Poetry Prize, of How to Think Like a Poet, of Proteus Bound, Selected Translations 2008 to 2020, and of In Ghostlight. His work appears in periodicals such as Best American Poetry, 5 Points, the Hopkins Review, the New Criterion, the Sewanee Review, and the Yale Review. Ryan lives in Texas and teaches in the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. He is emeritus editor of Literary Matters and co-editor with April Lindner of Contemporary Catholic Poetry, which was released by Paraclete this year. Ryan, welcome.
Thanks so much, Todd. I'm really delighted to be here. Looking forward to talking.
Segment 1. What do poems do? In the opening lines of Contemporary Catholic Poetry, Ryan Wilson writes about the 2020 archaeological discovery of an 8-mile-long stone wall in the Amazon rainforest that is covered in artwork. He writes this, quote, "Among the tens of thousands of paintings are depictions of long-extinct Ice Age flora and fauna, such as the mastodon, and of masked human figures dancing hand in hand like some holy ritual forgotten eons ago. Many more of the paintings are simply images of a human being's hand. Innumerable human hands from 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, from roughly 9,000 years before the siege of Troy represented in Homer's Iliad. Those humans who pressed their muddy hands against a stone wall so long ago are nameless now. Their entire civilization remains a mystery to us. And yet, their handprints elaborate geometrical designs and exquisite paintings, which reveal to us glimmers from a lost world, each image speaking in a dazzling silence for its maker, illuminating our imaginations with the tacit assertion, I was here." Ryan, this is a profound consideration. Why do human beings, especially through creative art and literature, have the compulsion, if that is not too strong of a word, to declare to others that they were here?
Yeah, it's a great question, Todd. It gets to why do people make art, right? If we follow it back to Aristotle will point toward mimesis, and he will say ultimately that all learning, all knowledge is mimetic. The way we learn to talk is by looking at our mother's mouth when our mother is speaking and imitating precisely that. There is in us something that is imitative, something that is speculative, right? If I can use that word in its etymological sense of the speculum, the mirror. There's something that wants to mirror back what we see, mirror back what we love. And very often, the desire to create a piece of art is simply a desire to mirror back what we love. And yet, there is something inside of us that yearns for articulation. There is a desire for self-knowledge. There is a desire for transcendence of our mortal bodies. And this longing for the eternal is in everyone. Everyone feels it. And we look for ways to express this sense of our immortal destiny that we have within us. Now, many people now consciously don't believe in an immortal destiny for human persons. And yet that longing is within us, that yearning for something that is greater, that yearning for contact with that which is beyond us. And so whether it's spraying graffiti on the side of a train or a building or pressing your hand against a stone wall 10,000 years ago, there is this desire to be remembered, to leave some mark that we were here, that we are more as human beings than simply material. We are more than simply natural beings. We have something immortal within us.
It's so well said, and it does seem when I was reading this about this discovery, this 8 Mile Wall, and just obviously very very recently, and to see that and what it testifies to, it is striking that the person who doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in the transcendence, doesn't believe that human beings are something other than simply mammal or this kind of higher end of the animal kingdom, but simply and utterly animal alone. I don't know how people reckon with the notion that the only animal in their world that actually is crafting art on the wall of a cave or what have you are human beings. It transcends any behavior. I'm not saying that ants don't build anthills and other animals don't build birds and birds sing and so on and so forth. But it is a curious thing that human beings would represent art or the artistic or tell story across thousands and thousands of years, and that we're not different than just the rest of the animal kingdom that's kind of running around and eating, reproducing, killing, and dying. So it's a profound testimony. So I'm going to ask you, Ryan, do you let's talk about poetry. How does poetry in particular serve this purpose? So from epics to sonnets, from light verse to the turgid phrase, how do words hemmed in by rhythm and rhyme, structure and symbol, how do they matter? Why do they matter? And why do they stay with us over all these years?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. And without going too far into the weeds, I fear that I may have to meander a bit in
Meander away.
answering. So, the first thing I would say is that poetry is not, as many people think, an essence. That is a pure thing that exists in this line or in that line. That understanding of poetry was quite popular in the 19th century, and it was given a name by the great poet and critic Matthew Arnold. He called such lines touchstones, right? So one of his touchstones is Piccarda Donati in Canto 3 of the Paradiso, when she says, "In la sua volontà nostra pace." In his will is our peace.
Mm.
It's a good line, right? But that line alone, it's nice. Where it gains its force is from the context of the entire Divina Commedia, right? When we have gone through the Inferno and we have seen the violence and the horror and the hideousness that comes from disobedience to God's will, when we have ascended Mount Purgatorio and we have seen the struggle of the purgation to reconcile the human will to God's will, and we've seen the violence there. When we get into the Paradiso and we hear this line, "In la sua volontà nostra pace," it suddenly carries with it this enormous power. It's a crystallization in language of what we have intuitively come to understand for ourselves as we journey with Dante Pilgrim. So all of that is a roundabout way of saying that poetry is not a particular line. It's not a particularly pretty or felicitous way of saying something. Poetry is fundamentally about a totality that is comprised of tension. So, to understand this, we might simply talk about hermeneutics, right? In a great poem, every single word of every line is exactly where it should be, and it is working together with all the other words in patterns. And these patterns come together to create a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And in creating this whole that is greater than the sum of the parts, what happens is the many are unified into the one. We see a form that informs each part of the poem. We glimpse this overform that is the totality of the poem, which is not direct, right? So we can think about it almost as the poet is using language in a cataphatic kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
but the form is apophatic. It's pointing beyond language. It's pointing toward something greater than any of the words or the phrases at all. And so when we're reading a great poem and we're finding how the many can be unified in a vision, in a transcendent form, what we are doing is, in a certain sense, ascending Jacob's ladder,
Mm-hmm.
which we might align with Diotima's staircase in the Symposium. We're getting a glimpse of an ideal form. Now, this practice of reading great poetry in such a way that we glimpse this form is ultimately pointing toward the transcendent ground of being. And it is an analog for how we should teach ourselves to see in our everyday lives, to recognize that God is the ground of all being, and therefore to live with a joyfulness and a sense of wonder and gratitude for being itself.
I just want to keep listening because I think this is fantastic, Ryan. It's interesting what you just did, and it wasn't meandering. It was unfolding poetry, the majestic aspect of poetry when it's looked at in its totality. I couldn't help but think about the modern world we're living in, and think about how much um, bodies of works are broken down, bodies of works are excerpted, are quoted, and the context gets lost. And I'm curious that as a person who recognizes, if you pull this quote out of the canto of Dante's Paradiso that you just mentioned, and you read it and you're moved by it, and especially in its original language, that's one thing. But when you encounter it in its proper context, in the unfolding of the drama of this lost poet descending into the inferno, reckoning with the notion of the plight of the wayward of God, climbing Mount Purgatory, and going through the proper but difficult purgations, arriving at Paradiso, to the ultimately the beatific vision. All of a sudden, that very same line takes on profoundly new meaning because of all that led up to it. I'm just curious, is it maddening for you? I mean, are you indulgent of a culture that is very distracted and very fragmentary in its hunger and clawing for knowledge, that it just takes quotes and excerpts and never reads the original work? There's a piece in the Atlantic Monthly right now about how these students don't read complete novels anymore in college, and so on. They almost seem to have a lack of capacity of reading full novels. So in sum, my question is this maddening for you as a poet to say, yes, you have that quote, yes, you have that excerpt, yes, you've memorized this, but you don't understand the full context? Not that you have to be a PhD in literature to understand it. Or instead of being maddened by it, are you sort of, do you say that's just the way things are, and our best work is to help to reclaim the context, help to help people understand the greater meaning and what this poem is pointing towards, as opposed to getting lost in the fragments? I thought that was a very long and meandering question. I'm sorry about that, but are you maddened by this modern fragmentary approach to poetry, or are you heartened by the opportunity to educate people otherwise?
Well, Todd, it's a terrific question. And I would say that the fragmentariness that we experience is nothing new.
Yeah.
Right.
Good point.
When Eliot is writing The Wasteland, he says, "These fragments I have shored against my ruin." And he has all of these quotations, but they're all in a jumble.
Yeah.
Right. Very much like what you're talking about now. And what this fragmentariness is indicative of is ultimately a disintegration. Right. If we recall that integer, the root of integrity and integrate, that means wholeness. Right. A whole number in math is an integer. Right. So disintegration, a breaking down of wholeness into fragmentary parts, has been going on for a long while. And in fact, one can read The Wasteland as an oblique criticism of Arnold and Arnoldian touchstones. Eliot had a sort of grudge to pick with Arnold's approach to poetry. So it's nothing new, this sort of fragmented vision. But I think that it does speak to an ultimate disintegration that we see very commonly within the human person, within our culture itself. There's a breaking apart of the whole. And things are always breaking apart, right?
Yeah.
Yeats said 100 years ago, the center cannot hold.
Yeah.
Things are always breaking apart. And poets are always trying to put them back together again, right? So our job as poets is always to meet the reader where the reader is. My model for this is, of course, Christ meeting the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. He doesn't wait for her to come to him. He goes to her. And not only does he go to her, he then tells her everything about herself.
Yeah.
Tells her everything about her life. And that's what we poets really are trying to do. We're trying to meet the reader where the reader is and hold up a mirror and say, this is you.
Yeah.
This is me. This is who we are, right? Poetry is not about the poet. The poet is the least important person involved in a poem. Poetry is about the audience, right? And it's always about trying to delight the audience and instruct the audience. Horace said this long ago in his Ars Poetica. Delectare or prodesse, he says, to delight or instruct. Well, generally speaking, instruction, Aristotle would say, is delightful. Now, many of my students may disagree with Aristotle on that and say that instruction is not always delightful. But the poet can do both. The poet can go to where the reader is and try to offer delight, entertainment, a laugh, something moving, anything. But use that delight in service of prodesse, of guiding the reader to a new place, to a new vantage point from which things can be seen with fresh eyes, right? From which the sort of day-to-day or quotidian, which so easily blurs into a background that we don't see anymore, the way that a picture hanging on the wall will disappear. We don't look at it all the time, right? The poet can help us to see it again and see it with fresh eyes. And very often, poetry's ideas are quite simple. People often get afraid of poetry. They think, oh, I've got to put my thinking cap on. What is this? Lyric poetry, the ideas tend to be quite simple. Things like memento mori, remember that you are mortal. Carpe diem, seize the day. Memento vivendi, remember to live. Right? These are not thinkers.
No.
Right? And yet, if you went through an anthology of the greatest lyric poems in the English language, probably half the poems in there would say one of those three things, ultimately as a theme. So why? Well, it's because we're always forgetting these things. We're always forgetting that we are mortal. If anyone doesn't believe me, I recommend driving on the interstate sometime, right? You see the crazy people going 100 miles an hour a week. They've obviously forgotten that they are mortals, right? These same things, we're always forgetting them. And poets are always saying, no, remember, you are mortal. You are human. You are limited. Try to make the most of your time. These very simple ideas. And so the way then is not, poetry has some big idea most of the time. It's that poetry can bring these familiar ideas to a reader in a new way that's delightful and can help us remember again those things that we are always forgetting.
I just love that. And you have a quote where in contemporary Catholic poetry, you write, times change and the cultures of specific places change along with them, but poets seem always to be fending off forgetfulness. And you're getting at, what are we forgetting? We are forgetting the memento mori. We're forgetting carpe diem. I want to ask you, because you do make a specific point, again, in your wonderful introduction to this book, about talking specifically about those two traditions, memento mori tradition, a carpe diem tradition in poetry. First, I want to ask you, Ryan, why do we keep forgetting these things? What is it with us in our human condition that causes us to keep forgetting And then when you're teaching these students in the Masters of the Fine Arts program at University of St. Thomas, why is it that when an epiphany alights upon them that you've helped usher in with an interpretation of a poem or an exposure to a poem or a particular interpretation of a poem or so on, why does it seem like, whoa, somebody just got hit in the head with a ball peen hammer? I never knew that, or I had forgotten that. What makes us so somnolent to these truths that seem to be eternally returning to us if we just open our eyes? What's your sense about that?
Well, ultimately, I think we have to blame Adam and Eve for this, right? When we think about our Lord at Gethsemane,
Yeah.
right? Can you not stay awake for 1 hour
Mm.
and pray with me? We can't. We're always falling asleep. And it is the weakness of the flesh. It is how easily distracted we are. And it's honestly, very often, simply a retreat into what I would call a Weltbild of our own making. The world image that we make in our head, which is not necessarily reality at all.
Yeah.
Right? We get an idea in our head of the way that things are supposed to go, the way that things are supposed to be. And where we get these ideas, there's no telling.
Yeah.
We get them from all over the place, honestly. But we set up a world in our mind, and we are very busy in there, trying to make things go the way that we think they ought to go. And we forgot that we are not in total control of ourselves, and that the world that we have in our mind is not reality itself. We often think that we are the host and the world is the guest in our mind, when in fact it's exactly the opposite. Right? And why does this happen, Todd? As I say, I think ultimately it's just that we are fallen.
Yeah.
And we are separated from nature by the fall. So it's an ancient thing. It's not anything that we can probably get rid of. I think meditation, in the Salesian sense or the Ignatian sense, can help us to fend this off. I think that reading great poetry can help to fend off the somnolence. And yet, we know we're going to fall asleep again. I'm fond of quoting Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright and novelist, in his last work called Worstward Ho. He says famously, "Fail again, fail better." And I think that's what we're all doing as Christians, as human beings, as poets. We're always failing. Fail again, fail better.
So well said, Ryan. It is interesting because when you think about the Catholic narrative in particular, the notion of the narrative of dignified, fallen, redeemable, so much great poetry, as you said, it kind of gathers. It has a form. It has a context. It revivifies life. It reminds us of mortality. It challenges us to use the talents and use, don't bury the talents, but actually go and invest them and so on. It's striking that the Catholic narrative is so in keeping with what our daily experience is. And also, as you're describing, the unfolding of poetry and why poetry works the way it does in many ways, written as well as it is by the greats. And the modern greats, it speaks to that Catholic narrative. It's funny, you make me think about The Moviegoer, Walker Percy's great work, and one of the things that Walker Percy talks about is, or Bing Spalling, the protagonist in this work, talks about is kind of getting trapped in everydayness, and then at some points when he gets injured in the Korean War, he has a moment laying down with an injured shoulder, staring at a dung beetle working his way across the dirt. And he was brilliantly awake, and he was awake to the notion of the search, and to be in search of that thing, that transcendent thing, is to be fully alive, whereas to be trapped in everydayness is to effectively be asleep. And it strikes me that when you're speaking about what poetry does for you, what it does for other readers, what it does for your students, is it awakens people to the search, and it extracts them, sometimes forcibly, sometimes gingerly, from everydayness. Is that a fair another way of characterizing it?
Yes, I think it is, Todd. As I recall, Bink says something like, either you're onto something or you're
Yes.
dying.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and to a certain extent, right, this is true, right? If we're understanding life in its fullest sense, as something far more than just, our heart is still beating and we're breathing, life in its fullest sense is precisely this pursuit, this quest. I mentioned T.S. Eliot earlier, and Eliot famously wants to turn us into questers. That's what the wasteland is. We are
Yeah.
in search of the Holy Grail.
Yes.
When we're reading the wasteland, we're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together, the
Yeah.
disintegrated civilization to reintegrate it, the disintegrated self to reintegrate it. Right. The same thing is true of his poem, "The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock," where with the epigraph from Dante's Inferno, it's Guido de Montefeltro. And what we're then to take of the poem is that Mr. Prufrock himself is in hell. And it is our job, as it is Dante's job, to understand what this hell is and to get past it, right?
Wow.
To ascend past it. So Eliot wants to turn us into a quester. The same is true of Dante, very obviously. There's on a quest, and we are going with him. We are learning theology all along the way. Before Dante, Virgil's doing the same thing with Aeneas, right? Aeneas is such a wonderful model for us. Virgil sets up the Aeneid with his earlier poems, right? In the eclogues, in the 10th eclogue, famously Virgil writes, "Amor omnia vincit." Love conquers all. It's a famous line, right? Everyone knows that line. They may not know it's Virgil. In the Georgics, his next poem, he says, "Labor omnia vicit." Labor conquered all. Hard work and endurance conquered all. When we get to the Aeneid in the 6th book, we're going to find "Pietas iter durum vicit." Piety conquered the long journey. That same verb in different inflections comes back. That's on purpose. Piety for Aeneas is a combination of love and endurance, right? His mother is Venus, and he has to endure this journey. So we are meant to endure hardship and to carry love with us forward, exploring beyond the little worlds that we create for ourselves, being open and traveling outside of what is familiar, going on a quest in pursuit of ultimately the divine love.
That's wonderful. And by the way, what you mentioned before about remember that you too shall die, remember to live, seize the day. These are all mantras that fit well into the person who's got their backpack on and has got their walking stick and has a long journey ahead. These are three admonitions to live fully, live richly, and recognize that it doesn't last forever. And so engage with the great truths, engage with the great search, endure the great sacrifice, and so on. And it's what you just described, whether it be Eliot or Dante or others. Boy, what a necessary reminder in a world where so many are just wayward. They're stuck on their couch, lost in Netflix, and getting depressed. So that's extraordinary. I want to ask. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just very quick. A couple of things that I'm always saying. In fact, I think the first is that when we come to die, I don't think anyone on their deathbed will say, "I really wish I had spent more time arguing on Twitter."
Yeah.
Or, "I really wish I had, owned people in the comments section more."
Yeah, good one.
The second thing that goes with that is the thing that I find quite poignant is so many people sell themselves short. The greatest music, the greatest paintings, the greatest sculpture, the greatest poetry is all for you, whoever you are. It's all out there. And all this entire incredible world of beauty is there for the exploring. Don't settle for, the reality TV or, I don't want to pick on any particular thing,
Yeah.
but for the ready to hand, the facile, the ugly. there's an entire world of beauty, and it's there for you, whoever you are. It's just waiting for you.
Yeah.
So that's a thing that I always want to be sure to say is don't sell yourself short, right?
Yeah. Wonderful. Ryan, Flannery O'Connor was a little resistant. I'm going to shift for a minute to the book, Contemporary Catholic Poetry. Flannery O'Connor was a little resistant to being dubbed a Catholic novelist as opposed to being a novelist who happened to be Catholic. And it's not that Catholicism didn't inform her novel, but that the work should be able to stand alone as an excellent novel on its own merits without appending a label to it. So given that we're looking at contemporary Catholic poetry, this wonderful anthology that you edited, are there Catholic poets, and do you feel the same reservation that Flannery did about the label, or what's your sense?
Well, I tend to agree with Flannery on aesthetic judgments. I grew up not far from Andalusia, and grew up in a household. My mother actually, in the 60s, wrote a master's thesis on O'Connor, one of the first scholarly works on O'Connor. And so the idiolect in our household when I was a boy was all quotations from Flannery and Eudora Welty and these writers. So I have a soft spot for Flannery. These questions, I think, are they can be fraught. I don't think there's a happy answer. I think that we're asking the question is already sort of off the beaten path. I think we've lost the way when we're asking, well, how do we define? No one is in our book because they are Catholic.
Right.
Everyone is in there because they are good poets. They are also Catholics. That is to say, you get no points for having a correct theological view of the world, according to me. You get points for writing good poems.
Right.
So that's, I'm not a theologian. These arguments, generally, I think what they come down to is trying to classify writers in one way or another. That is, they're entirely critical. And maybe there's some value in them. But as one who is himself primarily a poet, I'm not crazy about setting up schema of categorization.
Yep.
I think that can often lead us to close doors that we need to leave open. And as Keats said, the poet is one who needs to be able to exist in uncertainty without grasping at reason. And maybe I live there a little bit too much. Maybe I could, do it with a little bit more reason sometimes. But I think ultimately, when we're making these distinctions, what gets lost so often is that poetry is primarily about pleasure.
Yeah.
It's about beauty and pleasure. And, whatever label we want to stick on it, if it's poetry, it will be pleasurable and it will be beautiful.
Yeah.
Not in a facile way, not in the way of being pretty, but in a way of creating a unity out of disunity. And the Renaissance, they called this the discordia concors, right? Bringing in as much variety of experience as you can and making it unified. So I think that's what poems are out to do. They're out to create unities. They're out to reconcile opposites. And the critic is out there saying, well, you've reconciled these opposites, but let's go back to the opposites and let's stop all this reconciliation and let's
let's scatter again as opposed to unify, right?
Right.
And it's funny because when my own, and asking that question too, and I really appreciate your answer, I'm drawn to the notion that I have a book, a contemporary Catholic poetry. I'm drawn to 100 great Catholic poems that Word on Fire released. I'm drawn to them in part because I'm looking for poetry that comes from a Catholic sensibility, if you will. And I wonder if in reading the greater context of Flannery's words about this, is that there was an attempt to kind of be an outside person, maybe outside of the Catholic faith or whatever, that want to kind of ghettoize the Catholic writer, the Catholic poet, so that they could be labeled. Well, you got to understand, you're reading this that's going to come from a Catholic perspective, and therefore you may not want to try it. Whereas, as we know, O'Connor, among other writers, is fully informed. Her work is fully informed with the Catholic sensibility, and yet you could read it and say, I don't know that I see any Catholicism. I'm shocked by what she's writing here. And yet the deeper strains of suffering and grace and dignity and calling and so on and so forth suffuse the work as she outlines it in The Habit of Being and so on. So I'm with you in the sense that I never want someone to tend to walk away from a person described as a Catholic poet or a Catholic novelist, or this is a Catholic film, because they're like, well, it's Catholic. That's not my wheelhouse. That's not my tendency, and so on and so forth. I want them to be invited into a great story, but I really want them to taste the Catholic sensibility that comes from a Catholic writer that made that story. So I don't know if does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the plain facts, Todd, is that people don't buy books, and this is lamentable, but it is true. And people increasingly don't read books, and so I think one of the ambitions of this anthology was, well, if you are a Catholic or you're interested in Catholicism, um, and you don't know anything about poetry, about contemporary poetry, well, here's a place to start. It's not a place to end. Hopefully, it will whet the appetite and create a lifelong interest in poetry, both contemporary and ancient, right? So it's intended as an invitation. This is just a small sampling of some of the best of contemporary Catholic poetry. But ultimately, the goal is to, as we were saying earlier with Eliot, to turn people into sort of pilgrims who are pursuing poetry, whether it's contemporary or ancient, ideally, in fact, trying to unify those. Very often in America, we have a sense that poetry stopped really being a thing sometime around 1964 when Robert Frost died. Not a lot of people can name a living poet.
Yeah.
And it's part of this disintegration that we were talking about, right? Part of the goal of this book and of the work that I've done generally is to try to reintegrate. I did a book called Proteus Bound that's translations from 7 different languages, starting with Homer and going to the 20th century. And the goal there is to make available so much of the great Western tradition. But then that's not enough. And say, well, there were great writers back then. Mr. Frost and Flannery, and there were great writers back then. Yes, absolutely. And we should honor them and welcome them. But there are great writers now, too.
Yeah.
And the hospitable soul needs to welcome every guest. We need to welcome the great writers of the past. We also need to be open to the great writers of the present. That's what a culture looks like, an integral culture, a whole culture. You welcome the past, what's best of the past, and you welcome what's best of the present. And you try to reconcile them rather than, well, this is this old thing, and here's what we do now. This kind of fragmenting of the present moment from the past, all it does is inhibit our ability to understand ourselves because we no longer understand where we came from. Right? As Cicero famously said, the man who does not know what happened before he was born is destined to forever be a child. Right? And part of a mature civilization, mature culture, a mature individual is this integrity, is trying to reconcile the past and the present and ultimately the future and find a continuity. So this anthology is simply an invitation for people who are interested in contemporary poetry or people who are Catholic or interested in Catholicism. It's an entrance into what I hope will be a much longer journey.
It's a wonderful book, and we're going to read a few poems in a future segment here. So, but no, it's extraordinary. Segment 2, From the Pocket or the Guts. The French poet and essayist Charles Pagoy once insisted, quote, "A word is not the same with one writer as with another. One tears it from his guts, the other pulls it out of his overcoat pocket," close quote. So Ryan, as a poet yourself, how difficult is it to write poetry? And would you say being a poet is more of an acquired skill or an inborn intuition or a mix of both?
It's a great question, Todd. So back in my youth in Georgia, I was something of a jock. And so a lot of my figures tend to be sports related. So bear with me here.
Sure.
Right. So I love basketball. Still love basketball. I have bad knees now. I'm old. I'm out of shape. I can't play anymore. But for many years, I played a lot of basketball. And there are different ways you can play basketball, right? Most people like to go out in the driveway and shoot hoops, right? That's fun. That's really good. In my heyday, into my 30s, I could go run with Division III guys at Johns Hopkins, had a lot of fun with them, and I could kind of hang with them. Well, one day I was in the gym at Johns Hopkins, and a guy came in who had played in the NBA's developmental league, not in the NBA, but in the developmental league, like the minor leagues. And I end up matched up with this guy. Well, my thing, Todd, was I would just run people to death. Run you off screens, catch, shoot. That was it.
Yeah.
So first couple of times down the court, I'm running, and I get open, hit a shot. He was taking it easy on me. But I was thinking, oh, this guy's nothing. I can really play. And then I discovered I could not really play because I couldn't get the ball again. I could not get, it didn't matter. He was so much better than I was. And the same thing, right? Going to watch an NBA game. If you played enough, you realize this is a different thing from what I do.
Yeah.
It is categorically different from what I do when I, quote, play basketball, right? And in poetry, it's something similar, right? That a lot of people like to write verses for themselves, like shooting hoops in the driveway. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great thing. It's a fun thing. People should do it. There's a similar distance between shooting hoops in the driveway and the NBA as there is between just sort of writing down some verses and trying to write great poetry at the highest level, right? There's an enormous amount of technique that goes into writing poetry at the very highest level. When I teach the rudiments of poetry, of versification, students of all ages, they're blown away. They can't believe that there's so much in this poem. And it's because the best poetry makes it look easy. Yeah. Just like the NBA players make it look easy. When LeBron James jumps from the free throw line and throws down a dunk, he makes it look easy. And you think, I could do that. And then you go and try to jump from the free throw line. You go about 2 feet and you say, no, I can't. Right? He makes it look easy.
Yeah.
W.B. Yeats famously said, a line may take us hours, maybe. Yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. It has to seem easy. Ovid, at the end of the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, famously says, ars est celare artem. The art is to hide the art. So the great poets make it look easy. But it's not easy. So it takes a very long time to develop a craft and a vision. Notably, Robert Frost was 41 or 42 when his first book of poems was published. And it was published in England. Nobody in America was interested.
Wow.
This is Robert Frost we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? So it takes an awful long time. Now, some people get there faster than others, right? Some people are prodigies. There are not as many in poetry as there are in, say, music, right? In music, we hear about Mozart at 4 years old. He's playing before the kings and queens. Or more recently, if you like blues music, Derek Trucks was 10 years old and picked up a guitar and just knew what to do with it. That doesn't happen in poetry as much, though there are some instances of it. Alexander Pope was 11 years old when he wrote his Ode on Solitude, which is an immortal poem. Arthur Rimbaud in France was 14, 15, 16 when he was writing immortal poetry. But generally, it takes people a long time. So this comes back to your second question, which is, are poets more made or are they born? And the answer is that it's a combination of both, as it is with great athletes, right? Part of it is a natural ability, but natural ability isn't enough. You can have lots of natural ability, but if you don't work hard, you're not going to make it to the NBA, or you're not going to be a great NBA player. The same thing in poetry. You can have lots of natural ability, but if you don't work hard, you're not going to be as good as you could be. And similarly, maybe you don't have as much natural ability, but if you work really, really hard, you can still get into the league, right? You can still write at a very high level. So there's not one answer. right?
Yeah.
It's different for every poet in the way that it's different for every great athlete.
Ryan, out of curiosity, does you look at Spotify? So once upon a time, the 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 door on the handle to get into a widespread publicity for your work, your music, was held by few hands. Few people could lead you there. There was opening people who owned record labels and so on and so forth. And so just a certain number of people could climb to that level. Well, now with Spotify, we have this democratization where if with a little bit of work and a little bit of money, all of a sudden you're on Spotify, you can gain a following, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this access that people who have less means to go to those highest levels, which it seems like it's great. There's a democratization. Simultaneously, you can have an awful lot of really terrible music that's getting out there and gaining viral followings and so on and so forth. Now we have people, everybody has a blog, almost everybody has a podcast. I hope I'm not just almost everybody, but there are days. My question for you is, does this, as you said, no problem. It's really neat that people want to shoot hoops in their front, yard and all this kind of stuff. But as an accomplished poet yourself, and not a snob, you're a really nice guy, an accomplished poet yourself, and educating people to become accomplished poets and so on. Does that democratization, does that water down the quality of the work that's getting out there, so that there's a lot of people that are admiring really sloppy work that you'd say as an expert in this, well, this is really sad because they're walking past all these masterpieces and this stuff is kind of trash? Or is it like, you know what, if it's a chord being strummed from the depths of someone's soul and it comes out there and it's not of great form and someone's moved by it, God bless them, go with it. So what's your sense about the state of the highest levels of poetry in a profoundly democratized world of poetic offerings, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific question, Todd. I do want to say I'm profoundly offended to be called an expert. What a dreadful slur!
I take it back. I take it back.
Upon me. I think the Spotify thing. I don't even want to wade into that because I feel like Ted Gioia has all sorts of long, very intricate arguments about Spotify. I would say that, I don't listen to a lot of contemporary music. Most of what I do, I discovered through YouTube. Yeah. And it's stuff that is not from major record labels. It's people that are sitting on a porch. So, good things can come out of any sort of place.
Yeah.
Can anything good come out of Bethlehem? Yeah, it can. Yeah. Right. And often the gatekeepers do not have our best interests at heart. They have their own best interests and their wallets at heart. Right. And so, again, I don't want to go off into the weeds with gatekeeping. What I would say is that there's always been a superabundance of bad poetry. Even within great poets, most poems that they write are bad. I once heard the wonderful American poet, Richard Wilbur, maybe the most perfect American poet who's ever been. Wilbur said that he burned 85% of what he wrote. At this point, he was close to 90. He had twice won the Pulitzer Prize. He had been the Poet Laureate of the United States. He'd won every award you could think of. His poems will last as long as the English language. He said, I burn 85% of what I write. And I thought he was joking, like, I don't like. And he was like, no, I set it on fire.
Wow.
And the reason that he is, I think, the most perfect poet that America has had is because he was so hard on himself. Now, the 15% that he doesn't set on fire, that doesn't mean he's necessarily going to publish it.
Yeah.
He's just not going to burn it.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say, personally, not that I should be mentioned in the same sentence with Dick Wilbur, but I never send anything out for publication until it's been in a drawer for at least a year. Roman poet Horace said, put it in a drawer for 9 years. That's a little too slow for me, although he's generally right. There are poems that have taken me 9 or 10 years to get right. a poem that's just out in First Things this month. It took me, I think I started it 8 years ago and I finished it this year, and it's 14 lines.
Wow.
But all this to
Wow.
say is, poets need to be hard on themselves and restrict what they're putting out there. That's their obligation, is not to flood the market, as it were, with bad writing. And even when we're that hard on ourselves, probably still most of what comes out is bad. So that's always been the case, right? That was true in Victorian London. It's true now. There's maybe more media now. There are more ways that you can encounter bad poems, but bad poems are going to be out there. And
Yeah.
here's the thing, a lot of bad poems have a lot of charm to them.
Yeah.
And often bad poems are gateways to good poems, right? You discover in this bad poem, you say, this person's interesting. And then maybe they mention someone else and you look them up and suddenly now you're reading good poetry. So I'm for wide open, read what you like, but also keep in mind what I was saying earlier, that, don't sell yourself short. Don't be contented with what's easy, and know that the greatest things out there are for you. So if you like a poet that you see on the, Instagram or something, that's great, fine. But remember also that Dante is waiting for you.
Yeah.
And Milton is waiting for you, and Homer and Virgil are waiting for you. And don't rest easy with what comes easy, right? Be a little bit discontented with what is too easy, right? Be a little bit arrogant and think, I want more, because you do, whether you know it or not. We all want the beautiful, and it's out there just waiting for us.
I'm still thinking about you putting your poems in a drawer for a year. I think that's amazing. So I want to ask you about that, because one of the things I was thinking about asking you was, when do you know that a poem is finished? When is a poem good enough? And out of curiosity, and this is thinking about your craft, do you write a poem that's been engendered by something in your life right now? And I would think you would have this impulse to get it out there, because it's almost like it's a release to kind of put this out there, and maybe it's for you more than for somebody else. And so it doesn't need to be out there. It's yours and it's out of you, and therefore it's complete. But my question for you is this something that your kind of standby rule of a year or more? Do you go back to it? Are you changing adjectives? Are you altering punctuation? Are you adding lines? Are you scratching things out because of you're turning this over in your head? Is there a feeling in you that lets you know now is the time? How does this? What happens to this poem from now to a year from now in your life?
Yeah, I'm very happy with this question, Todd. So the reason I don't rush anything out is precisely because when I'm first writing something, it's usually about me. And what I was saying earlier, a poem is not about the poet.
Yeah.
The poem should be about the audience, right? So what happens? Gosh, usually, I think most people, when we write anything, there's a little window where we think, I'm brilliant. This is magnificent. Look at what a beautiful, incredible thing that I've just made. Yes, this is immortal. And the next day we look at it and we go, oh no, that is not. that was
This is mortal. It's definitely mortal.
It's definitely mortal, right? But there is, right? We get so into our head and we're so excited by it, and we put it down and we think, yes. And you get a little distance and you say, oh no. And for me, just knowing my ego, I know that if I write it and I put it in a drawer for a year, and I after a year I will have forgotten it. I won't remember it at all. I won't remember writing it. I won't be the same person I was when I wrote it.
Right.
And so at that point, I can look at the poem wearing my editor hat. Mm-hmm. And I can be hard on it, because whatever feelings engendered the poem are past.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not in that moment. And I can put on my editor's hat and I can say, oh no, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. And I can chip away at it.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes a year isn't enough, or I can't get the thing right, because, things as small as punctuation, I'll tell amusing story about E.A. Robinson on this matter. So, great poet E.A. Robinson, poet of Men of Cheevy, people will know, or Richard Cory, these famous poems. So he would summer at the MacDowell Colony, an artist colony. And one summer, there's a brash young novelist, hot young novelist is there. And he's very confident and swaggering. And at dinner, he goes up to Robinson and he says, "Well, Mr. Robinson, I wrote 3,000 words today. What did you do?" And Robinson says, "Well, I spent the morning putting a comma into a line, and I spent the afternoon taking it back out." Because there's, if we're aiming for perfection in our poems, which is what we should be aiming at, there's such intricacy. Each slight little thing really can take hours and days. And so after a year, if I see something in the poem, which I don't most of the time, I just think, well, that's trash and throw it away. But if I see something in it, then I'll maybe work on it, and it probably won't be finished, and it goes back in the drawer. And over time, just coming back to it, the poems that I publish are the poems where something occurred to me, a possible solution that would give the poem this significant form that I was talking about, that would give an integritas to all the parts and create a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. That's when I know it's done. And even then, after a poem has been published and has been in a book, sometimes I still go back and I think, oh no, I should have moved this here. I should have done. So I believe it was Paul Valéry who said, poems are never finished, they are abandoned. And to some extent that may be true, but I like to think that in my own work that I strive not simply to abandon fragments, but to have brought things to a point where they have integritas, harmonias, and claritas. That is, where they are beautiful. And all the parts work with all the other parts. Everything comes together as a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And that ultimate form, informing each of the parts, provides a claritas or a radiance for the poems. Probably is not true of everything, but that's the goal, Todd.
Ryan, when George Steiner considered the disappearance of the great writers in the Soviet nightmare, he reminded us that their work is remembered today because they were memorized in the darkness. And he said, as long as 10 people know a poem, it will live. We must learn things by heart, he insisted, saying the most important tribute any human being can pay to a poem or a piece of prose he or she really loves is to learn it by heart, not by brain, but by heart. What you know by heart, the bastards cannot touch. They cannot take it away from you. So would you, Ryan, agree with this? Are you a proponent of poems being memorized? And are there any poems you've committed to memory that have edified you? You've got a vast arsenal of quoted insights, which I think are so wonderful, peppered throughout our whole conversation. What's the role of the memorization of poetry today for others and for you?
She is as in a field a silken tent at midday when a sunny summer breeze has dried the dew and all its ropes relent, so that in guise it gently sways at ease, and its supporting central cedar pole, which is its pinnacle to heavenward and signifies the sureness of the soul, seems to owe naught to any single cord, but strictly held by none, is loosely bound by countless silken ties of love and thought to everything on earth the compass round, and only by one's going slightly taught in the capriciousness of summer airs of the slightest bondage made aware. That's Robert Frost's poem, A Silken Tent. The reason I got to have a wonderful conversation with Richard Wilbur is I was at a dinner party where he was, and I was terrified of him. The great poet. I was 23 or 4. But the conversation turned among some other very illustrious, wonderful poets, Brad Lighthouser, Mary Jo Salter, and Wilbur. Oh, nobody memorizes poems anymore. And they got on that, and I thought, I'm ready for this. I can chime in. And so I just rattled off the Silken Tent fast like that, knowing that Wilbur had been dear, dear friends with Robert Frost. And so then he took a shine to me and things went very well. We had lovely conversation. Why? Why do I mention that story? Because that's what memorization does. It brings people together. I am a great proponent of memorizing poems. I've always made my undergraduates memorize poems, and they always start off hating me for that. They really resent me for that. And yet, so the first poem I always make them memorize is Shakespeare's Sonnet 29, and the second poem is Shakespeare's Sonnet 5. So they can learn how vastly different rhythms can function in poems with the exact same meter, the exact same rhyme scheme. And so a couple weeks into the semester, I see them walking across the quad and they're shouting Shakespeare at each other. And I think, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
I'm bringing them together with each other and with the past. I'm creating a unity. Memorization does that. So, yes, absolutely. There's an old idea that to be a poet, you need to have 10,000 lines by heart. And I stand by that. Sometimes, because we live in a fallen world, Todd, I'm willing to consider 1,000 lines as sufficient. But really, we need 10,000. We need more than 10,000. We need as much as we can of the best poetry to be inside of us. Why is that? So I mentioned my book, Proteus Bound. In the preface to that, I use a term from biology, holometaboly, right? When we eat food and we holometabolize it, it becomes us, right? On a cellular level, right? It's what we're made up of, right? Bodily. What we take into our minds and into our souls similarly becomes us. This is why I say that we shouldn't sell ourselves short. We need to recall Thomas's understanding of the habitus, right? His translation of Aristotle's hexis. The daily habits. What do we take in? Is it a bunch of junk food, or is it something that will nourish us? Is it a bunch of ephemera, or is it immortal beauty? The more that you bring immortal beauty into you, the more that it lives inside you, you hollow metabolize it, it becomes you. And it's easier then, obviously, to write beautiful verse when you have a head and a heart full of it.
Yeah. This goes back to me to the gospel, where Christ is saying the eyes are the lamp or the light of the body, and to my way of thinking, I know there's deeper theological strains to that story that Christ, or that mandate Christ is offering, but to my way of thinking, I think about, what do we set our eyes on? What are we nursing ourselves on, in terms of the hopeful, the true, the good, and the beautiful, that which is hopeful, that which is promising, that which is redemptive, or are we stuck in the gutter of darkness, of brokenness, of vengefulness, of resentment, and so on? And I to your point that covers this entire conversation about, don't sell yourself short. This was made for you. Imbibe this beauty. Take in that which is transcendent. When I'm reading the great transcendent works, I'm lightened, I'm lifted, I'm inspired, I'm a new person. The light in my eyes, the lamp of my body illuminates the rest of me. Whereas if I find myself in the darkness of the guttural aspects of modern politics, or dark stories, or whatever the case may be, my eyes grow dark and my body grows dark with it. And so I think there's so much to be said about the transcendent nature that is a diet that either we engage in ingesting the right kind of diet or the wrong kind of diet, and our hearts and our souls quickly follow. Is that a fair way of saying that?
Yeah, Todd, I'm reminded of Richard of St. Victor, who said, Ubi amor ibi oculus. Where your love is, there your eye is. Vice versa, where your eye is, there your love is.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a great question, I think, that we should be asking ourselves, is what are we loving? What are we serving? What are we praising when we're looking at something? Because so much of our lives is determined by what we are taking in, what
Yeah.
we are looking at, what we choose to see. And as I say, there's all this incredible beauty in the realm of art. There's also creation, which is pretty doggone beautiful too.
Yeah.
And so there's all this wonder that is out there. Now, I don't want to be a wonder monger and say, this will solve all of your problems.
Sure.
Go forth and be in awe. But often what happens when we are not challenging ourselves to go outside of what we're comfortable with or what's easy or what's handed to us, what happens is we start to close ourselves in.
Yeah.
We close ourselves in with the magic box in the hand, and we're just staring at this, and we're missing everything around us. And when we close ourselves in, focusing on what's happening right now in Washington or wherever it is, and we're missing everything else that's happening around us. We start boxing ourselves in. And when we do that, it's very easy to move into a place spiritually of grievance and grudge, and it's not a great space to be in. We need to open the doors of our souls and step out and see what's beyond us, right? The world is always calling to us. The beauty of the world is always calling to us. We just have to listen.
Yeah.
And go look at the beauty of creation. Go read a beautiful poem. Listen to Mozart or Haydn or Handel. Get out of ourselves, right? Break that sort of endless loop. And, it's not the solution to all problems, but it certainly is a healthier habitus, a healthier way of going through our daily lives.
Ryan, you've mentioned so many names that I love: Robert Frost and T.S. Eliot and Samuel Beckett and Dante and Shakespeare and so many others. I know I personally, but I think many of our listeners would love. And again, we're going to move into segment 3, our final segment, and hit some of the wonderful talent in this book. Who are the enduring poets everyone should read? And one specific question also: are there any treatises that we should be reading that are further unfolding what you're unfolding for us here about what poetry is and how we can love it even more? So first, who are the enduring poets everybody should be reading from your perspective? And secondly, any treatises that would further edify us?
So I'm going to answer the first question in a roundabout way.
Mm-hmm.
The first time that I read Romeo and Juliet, I was 13 or 14 maybe. And I think maybe I had a girlfriend for the first time. And it made perfect sense to me. Mom and dad won't let you be with your girlfriend. You make a suicide pact and run away, of course.
Yeah.
Going back to Romeo and Juliet, years later, I thought, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Terrible idea. No. Similarly, the first time I read King Lear, I don't know, I was 17 or 18. I thought, who cares about this old guy?
Yeah.
And then, my hair fell out.
You're Lear. All of a sudden, you're Lear.
And you start thinking, oh, you know what? Actually, and I use these illustrations to say that there's no one book or one writer for all people at all times.
Yeah.
There's you see often these sort of clickbait links, 10 books everybody should read right now. And I think that's nonsense, because we're all at different points in our lives. We're at different ages. You can't recommend to everyone all the time. So that question then is really difficult, because you don't want to say, go read this, because for a lot of people, Dante may not be right now.
Right.
And I think the most important thing is to read something that turns you on, that inspires you, that challenges you, that, so if it's Shakespeare, great. If it's Dante, it's great. If it's Virgil, it's great. If it's Eliot, it's great. You've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I would just say, start with what you're really into, and then follow it down the path, right? And eventually, hopefully, you do get to Homer and Virgil and Dante and Milton and Shakespeare and Eliot and these people. But I think it's risky to say, well, everyone should start here.
Yeah.
Because we're all starting from different places,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there's poetry out there for you, whoever you are, whatever place you're coming from. And there's so many great poets. This is one of the secrets, right? Is it's not that poetry didn't die in 1964. It's that there are literally hundreds of terrific poets in America right now. Hundreds. There's so much good stuff out there, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. It's happening right now. So you don't want a reading list from me because it'll be thousands of books long. As for treatises on poetry, I mean, again, there's so many. Maybe I'll list just a few that are standbys. It's helpful to know. Obviously, Aristotle's Poetics and the Rhetoric are very helpful. I would say really helpful also Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus, Gorgias as well. Horace's Ars Poetica, or the Epistles to the Pisos, which is Epistle 2-3 in Horace's Epistles. Sidney's Defense of Poesy. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good start.
I love it.
I would also, and a lot of people come on to podcast, Todd, and they want to promote themselves and their books. And I'm not here to do that. I'm here to say that the best treatise on poetry is Ryan Wilson's How to Think Like a Poet, available for purchase now from Wise Blood Books.
Oh, you don't say. That is not a shameless plug. That's perfectly placed. It was, I opened the door. I want you to run through it. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. Contemporary Catholic Poetry and a New Catholic Moment. In contemporary Catholic poetry, Ryan Wilson mentions the Catholic moment in American literature, saying this, quote, "Between 1944 and 1969, Catholic writers received the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for Poetry and Fiction 9 times. Twice was a Catholic named Poet Laureate of the United States. A host of Catholic writers enjoyed renown in this period. Daniel and Ted Berrigan, John Berryman, Robert Fitzgerald, Isabella Gardner, Julian Green, Josephine Jacobson, Jack Kerouac, Robert Lowell, Phyllis McGinley, Claude McKay, Thomas Merton, John Frederick Nims, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Catherine Ann Porter, J.F. Powers, Kenneth Rexroth, Alan Tate, Hisaye Yamamoto, and many more," close quote. But Ryan, you go on to say that since 1969, no practicing Catholic has served as poet laureate, and only a handful have won the Pulitzer or the National Book Award. That brief Catholic moment you wrote, during which the American public treated the theology of the Catholic Church respectfully, can seem like ancient history. So Ryan, has the Catholic moment truly passed? And is there any chance it can come again?
Well, in a certain sense, it cannot pass, right? Every now is an iteration of the eternal now, as Augustine will tell us in the Confessions, right? But in terms of human culture, I would say it seems that has been the case, that there was a sort of falling away in terms of just the number of prominent writers who were Catholics. Can it come again? Absolutely, of course. Always. All things are possible. And certainly there are a lot of terrific writers today who are Catholic. And Many of them are obviously in this anthology, but there are also a great many who are lapsed and simply don't identify themselves as being practicing Catholics. And we tried not to include people who don't identify themselves as practicing Catholics, even though by baptism they are Catholics. So there's a lot of terrific Catholic writers out there, and what it would take, I think, as Dana Gioia talked about in The Catholic Writer Today, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, a long time ago now, he was calling for more Catholic writers. Yes, absolutely. But as I've told Dana many times, and as he well knows, we also need Catholic readers.
Yeah.
If we want there to be a Catholic literary culture, we need Catholic readers. We need Catholic editors. We need Catholic presses and publications. We need Catholic editors at secular presses and publications. We need, above all, readers.
Yeah.
Right? So, can it come again? Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully, people will be inspired by some of the poems in this book and inspired by so many of our wonderful Catholic writers and get engaged with contemporary literature. That's how to create a culture, right? You have to engage. Nobody's going to do it for us. If you want to build something, you just go build it.
Yeah.
Y'all at Word on Fire know all about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've been really impressed, just in my position with editing the journal and the podcast, the number of works that are coming from emerging Catholic publishing groups. It's extraordinary. I mean, I think there's this groundswell it's a grassroots groundswell of extraordinarily good work, good fiction, good poetry, great essays. I mean, just coming out of the woodwork. I'm mixing a ton of metaphors here, but it's coming in from all sides, and I do think that more people are hungry, especially in a wayward age. There's always been, all ages have been wayward, but I think people are finding their way back to faith through the works of great literature, of great film, great poetry, and so on. And so I can't thank you enough for all that you are doing with this great work, contemporary Catholic poetry. I want to move into this, so let's talk about this book, Contemporary Catholic Poetry. Let's talk about some of the poets who are in the anthology. How did you select the poets? And you mentioned earlier about the quality of the poetry. How did you select the poets that would grace your pages? Was there a criteria that went into who makes it within the covers and who would sadly not make it? Or what's your sense?
Yeah. So it was very tricky trying to pin down some parameters.
Yeah.
And April and I spent a good deal of time thinking about it. So the first thing was we had to figure out, what does contemporary mean, right? And we set a date. We said, people born 1950 or after. And several of our poets in this anthology were born in 1950. It seemed like a felicitous date, but it meant that we had to leave out people whom we might otherwise have included. My friend Samuel Hazo, who is, I think, 95. Paul Mariani, the great poet. We had to leave these people out because they were older. Mm-hmm. Well, why did we do that? Well, if we included Sam Hazo, Sam was publishing in the 50s.
Yeah.
So we would then be publishing work from the 1950s, and then that would be Alan Tate and John Berryman, and suddenly the book just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's less space to include people who are writing today who are maybe lesser known than they ought to be. So we had to set the line somewhere, and it's lamentable. We missed Sam and Paul and some others, but that was part of it. And then we had to say, well, what does Catholic mean? And again, there's so many of our best poets who are lapsed Catholics, who are raised Catholics, cultural Catholics, these sorts of things. And we said, well, that we don't want to do something like that. We want it to be people who think of themselves, right, as Catholic, who generally are. So we said, well, people who have not publicly sort of forsworn or forsaken the church, the magisterium. So that was limiting. And then we said, well, we want people in here who have crossed over. It's a term that I use. It's a vague term. What does that mean? What I mean by that is poets who are publishing in prestigious journals, prestigious presses, as opposed to someone who has yet to break out of, say, exclusively Catholic publications. Not that there's anything wrong at all, of course, with exclusively Catholic, but we wanted somebody who maybe had a presence there, but also had a presence on the national scene a little bit more broadly, right?
Yep. Wider culture.
Poets who had established a broader reputation. And so those were our basic criteria. And then we went through and said, well, let's just pick what we think are their best poems, rather than picking, the poems that are about going to mass or something.
Sure.
Pick the poems that we like best.
Yeah.
Because, as you were saying with Flannery, right, being a Catholic writer doesn't mean exclusively writing about, going to church or talking to the priest or something like that. That often it's just in the background. It's an informing vision.
Yeah.
And so we wanted just to pick the best poems from these poets. And we were open to a lot of poems that might normally not make it into an anthology. Most anthologies, they just want the really short ones, because that way you can fit in more people and more poems. And we said, no, if the poet's best poem is long, we're going to put it in, even if it's really long. And so there are some longer poems in this book, but they're terrific. The idea was that every poem in here is a hit, right? All hits, no B-sides, with the best Catholic poets of our time who were born since 1950.
Well, the nice thing too is, like you said, this is the gateway also. Of course, you chose the good, like before you were talking about the gateway, bad poetry can be the gateway to good poetry. This is very, very good poetry that will be a gateway to greater works. If you want to explore these people more, there's books out there. They've published elsewhere. They're online and so on. This gives you whets your appetite with some of the best pieces through the eyes of, I'm not going to call you experts, but through the eyes of very talented poets yourselves. Guiding us, which is wonderful. Ryan, one of the things you said too in the introduction is worth the price of admission alone. It's a terrific introduction that you wrote. You mentioned that poems housed in this book have a vision of reality that's sacramental. I love that. I love that notion. How would you describe a sacramental vision of reality?
Yeah. So Todd, you may have picked up on a pattern. I'm going to be a little bit roundabout at answering that.
Yeah.
So I want to start with Plato. Okay. With Plato, we have two realms. We have the kinoma, the realm of emptiness, where we live and we see material appearances. And there is then the realm of the pleroma, the realm of fullness, the realm of forms. So those are separate, and there's no real way to move between them. What happens when Christ is incarnate is something like, thinking in Platonic terms, a union of the pleroma and the kinoma, right? The two come together. They're collapsed by God's entrance into the world, by the incarnation of Christ. And what that means is that we live simultaneously in time and in eternity. That each of our actions, our thoughts, our words have consequences not just in the here and now, but in eternity. And so there's a recognition in a sacramental vision of reality of the divine ground of all being, that all things that are happening in time have eternal significance and are pointing beyond themselves. That's a short précis.
I like it. That was plenoma and kinoma. Is that PL? I'm writing this down because I love what you're saying. PLEMONA and kinoma, KENOMA.
PLEROMA, pleroma.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is
and
tremendous.
And kinoma is KENOMA.
Thank you.
Right. So Christ, we talk about the kenosis of Christ.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That is the emptying out, and that's what unifies. Right. Yeah. That's what brings the realms together.
So, Ryan, this podcast would not be complete without us diving into a couple poems from this wonderful book, Contemporary Catholic Poetry. And I wondered if we could start page 113. We have Dana Gioia's Summer Storm. And given the fact that you are an eminent poet yourself and also an instructor, and I am not the type that should be reading this poem, but you are, would you mind reading it to us and just say a couple words about why this got included or something we should take away from it? And then we'll move through one or two more and do the same thing. So let's start with, if you're okay with it, and you have your book at the ready, Summer Storm by Dana Gioia.
We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry and watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars the storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers, as if we too might imitate the rain. Then, suddenly, the storm receded as swiftly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the group, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word, except to say good night. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm? A party 20 years ago. Its disappointments warm. There are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried. Other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life would be happier just by being different.
Beautiful. Tell us about this one, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of my favorites from Dana Gioia, who is among our very, very finest contemporary poets. And I was quite insistent that this poem be in the book. In fact, why? Well, I don't know that the poem needs a whole lot of academic explanation. I could say, wow, the silent as the stars, the storm hid from the night. He couldn't see the stars. He couldn't see his destiny, right? There are nice little details I can point to. I can say, well, Dana uses the ballad stanza, which is the meter of, say, Amazing Grace, right? And so it sounds like a familiar song. It's a common song. It's everybody's song because we all have this longing, this yearning, this sense of what if. But really, the poem is a reminder of how often we get lost in our own ingratitude. We forget what we do have. We take for granted the great things that we do have, and we focus on what we don't have. We focus on grievance instead of gratitude. And it's just a wonderful reminder, a lovely reminder that we're always doing this. We're always retreating into counterfactuals and might have beens. And it's a call to say, hey, snap out of that.
Yeah.
Pay attention to what you do have. Pay attention to what's in front of you. So just a terrific poem that I hope people will enjoy and revisit. I take pleasure in it every time I read it.
Let's go to Marie Howe's The Star Market. This is on page 117.
The people Jesus loved were shopping at the Star Market yesterday. An old lead-colored man standing next to me at the checkout breathed so heavily, I had to step back a few steps. Even after his bags were packed, he still stood, breathing hard and hawking into his hand. the feeble, the lame. I could hardly look at them. Shuffling through the aisles, they smelled of decay, as if the star market had declared a day off for the able-bodied. And I had wandered in with the rest of them, sour milk, bad meat, looking for cereal and spring water. Jesus must have been a saint, I said to myself, looking for my lost car in the parking lot later, stumbling among the people who would have been lowered into rooms by ropes, who would have crept out of caves or crawled from the corners of public baths on their hands and knees begging for mercy. If I touch only the hem of his garment, one woman thought, can I bear the look on his face when he wheels around?
Haunting. Your thoughts on this one?
One of the things that I love about this poem is its vocal modulation. It starts off with the speaker being sort of disgusted by people and their infirmities. And yet, when we get to the poem's conclusion, those last words, wheels around, very significant. There's a sudden recognition that the speaker herself is infirm, that the speaker's own infirmity is this very disgust toward others, not seeing the imago Dei in others. Her disdain for other people is in fact her infirmity and her own lack of wholeness. And so there's a sudden revelation that transforms everything that comes before. These figures that are seen as grotesque and other and distant, suddenly the speaker realizes she's one of them. And it happens on the last word, wheels around. Just like the stars in the cosmos wheel around, Christ wheeling around, as in, I believe it's Matthew 9, when the woman touches his garment, to be made whole again. The sudden wholeness, the revelation of her own sinfulness. It's a very subtle poem, a very powerful poem. Marie Howe is one of our very best, and she has a new book out. Her new and selected poems is just out a couple of months ago. If you're interested in contemporary poetry at all, I encourage you to read Marie Howe. She's so wonderful. And her aesthetics are different from Dana's. Dana is a poet that uses traditional meter and rhyme. Marie Howe does not. Her poems are based on this very sacramental vision that I was just discussing, but she presses it. She often uses very long lines that seem prosaic. They seem boring or flat. And she'll use the selection of an illuminated detail at the end of a poem so that you go back and you see everything in a new way. You see that everything that you read one way the first time is actually pointing in another direction. And her goal is to point out the presence of the illuminating, the presence of the revelatory in our everyday lives that we so often overlook. And so her poems are often very subtle, and they seem like they're just sort of about everyday things. But then there will be one little detail that illuminates everything else and makes quotidian experiences radiant, helps us to see them for what they are.
Kind of Flannery-esque to me. I felt like I got to the end of that one and I kind of got pinged in the forehead. To your point, that wheeling around and all of a sudden she's part of the walking wounded like everybody else. It was beautiful. Beautiful. Let's turn to Marianne Corbett's A Northeast Digs Out from Record Snowfall. That's on page 56.
All up and down the coast, where Saturday a generous snow came down, an ancient magic appears this morning. Every hack reporter in every local rag now lifts the lyre in lieu of pad and pencil. In New York, it is a milk-white morning. Snow transforms the straw-drab landscapes into winter postcards. Southward, the mood is darker. Like a cloak of madness falls the snow. Like one of those quiet obsessions you read about in stories. Figure and trope and image sift, drift over the dailiness of the papers. Even where the gods are feebler, on the weather page, the lyric muse now takes the words by storm. Fierce winds and dazzling whiteness, thigh-deep drifts, adjectives blowing thick and piling fast, and under everything, the sonorous meter of radios intoning cancellations. Those few lost souls with no poetic spark wander the parks and murmur, staring upward. So quiet and so lovely. And their awe is duly reported, being, perhaps, the news most worth reporting. Beauty changes us, calling up wonder from our deepest selves to its right place. Page 1, above the fold.
I love this one. Tell us more about this, Ryan.
Mary Ann, a tremendous poet and an incredible story. She worked for 30 years in the legislature of Minnesota and didn't write poetry at all. And then in 2000, Mary Ann, forgive me if I get the date wrong, 2005, 6, 7, in there, started writing poems and very quickly just skyrocketed and became just an outstanding poet. And she's so prolific, just remarkable. Wonderful poet, a wonderful person, a wonderful story. And here, she cuts right to the heart of the matter. Beauty, wonder, awe. That's the news that's most worth reporting.
Yeah.
Right? That's what needs to be on page 1 above the fold. And that's the news that poetry is always telling us. William Carlos Williams said something to this effect long ago. He said, let me get it right, something like, poetry is nothing new, but men die for the lack of news that's found there every day. Something like that. That's a loose paraphrase, and Williams says it better. But precisely the point that there is this beauty, there is this wonder, there is this awe, there is this appreciation and gratitude. And when we lose that, we can die of it. Our souls can wither up, right? We can become so distracted. And poetry is always reminding us, hey, take a look around. There's beauty. Even when poetry is describing things that are ugly or hideous or horrific, if it is poetry, the ugliness will be subsumed into a whole that is beautiful, in the way that the hideousness of the Inferno is subsumed into the whole of the Divine Comedy. Right? Poetry is itself, in its ordering, its patterning, and its beauty, a testimony to the power of the human spirit to make sense of, to make order out of horror and grief and suffering and loss, and transform that into something good.
Let's have one last poem from a accomplished poet by the name of Ryan Wilson called For a Dog. And this is on page 208.
Okay. I wasn't expecting this one, Todd. You've thrown me a curveball, sir. Right. For a dog. You'd wake us up. That shrill, insistent bark driving away whatever dreams had fogged our vision. And we'd rise in the true dark, wondering just what exactly, cataloged by canine instinct under threat, was there. What jogger, cat, or dog it was that dogged you from your drowse beside the easy chair and summoned your yapped pandemonium. 9 times in 10, it was just empty air. Some ghosted scent you sniffed. Dumb. were dumb, like all dogs, snuffling up to snakes, afraid of mice. When we said, come, you wouldn't come. You capered when commanded to play dead. And when we wanted most to be alone, you'd offer up that imbecilic head until we crowned your pity with a bone. Our lives took on the shape you spun from need, the harried grandeur of routine. You gone, the house is quieter, and we've been freed forever from the never-ending chores your tale entailed. The scrubbing where you peed, the hunting stain removers down in stores. What's hardest are the peaceful hours we wanted so much, when you were scratching up the doors and howling at some phantom thing that haunted the world without, some threat we couldn't see that you were desperate to have confronted. Now, you're part of that present unity of absences the living move among, in which what was, what will, and what can't be dance in a ring to a triumphant song we don't have ears to hear or heart to see, who sleep now perfectly and much too long.
So those of you who are listening don't know that I get to see Ryan as he reads this, like I see other guests when this is audio podcast, but I get the benefit of video. And Ryan, it's so wonderful to see with what love you read your own poetry. And you read it with wonderful devotion to everybody else's, but this is, you were showing, to my way of thinking, you pulled out your phone or you pulled out your wallet and you pulled out a couple of pictures of your own kids and you shared them with us. And it's, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and just seeing the light and the pain and a little bit of the bittersweet melancholy that accompanies this poem as well. It's absolutely visible in my seeing you. It's palpable in in the print on the page, and it's vibrantly alive in your voice. So, and to my way of thinking, that's an embodiment of poetry that transcends all the structure and order and so on and so forth. But what a treat to have you read that poem to us.
Thank you so much, Todd. And yes, performing a poem is different from writing a poem.
Yeah.
Being able to say a poem. So I'm so pleased that you think I did well with that.
Two last questions, Ryan, just so I can be sensitive to your time. Two big important questions. How can contemporary Catholic poetry evangelize our listing culture?
Well, it's a great question, Todd. I suppose the cat may be out of the bag, but I have furtively been evangelizing for many years, sort of under the radar. And maybe it's just time to come clean. The thing about it is ultimately that simply calling people to beauty will call people to God. Beauty is one of the transcendent attributes of God. And poetry leads people toward the beautiful, helps us to see the beautiful. And the more that we're doing that, the nearer we will get to God. So I don't think that poetry is a great evangelical tool, that is the purpose of it necessarily. But I think that people who are open to poetry, people who are open to beauty, they're likely to be led to sense the beauty of the cosmos, right? That's what the cosmos means. In Greek, it means the universe and also beauty. That is to say, reality is another word for beauty, or beauty is another word for reality. So, yeah, I think, these poems are not going to catechize anybody, but moving people toward beauty, I think, is a good start.
Finally, Ryan, how has poetry deepened your own faith and how have you personally been changed by it?
I was very fortunate, Todd, to figure out what I was meant to do with my life when I was 17. I discovered I was supposed to be a poet, and that has not been an easy thing to do. And it's required a lot of dedication. Um, but it was a gift. That was a grace to discover that when I was an otherwise pretty lost young man, finding a direction. And in learning to appreciate the order, the beauty, the integrity in poetry, it's deepened my sense of the order and beauty and integrity in the world. And so there's been a symbiotic development between my pursuit of poetry and my faith. The two inform each other back and forth all the time. And so it's oriented me, to use that in its proper sense. It has pointed me toward the east, toward the rising sun, which is, of course, a figure for our Lord.
Ryan Wilson, poet, co-editor of Contemporary Catholic Poetry, and crafter of the Sacramental Vision. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
My pleasure, Todd. Thank you.
So I've been thinking, discipline. It's not the first thing I think about when it comes to poetry. Now, notwithstanding my time with great modern poets like Dana Gioia and James Matthew Wilson, Sally Reed and Ryan Wilson, Joshua Wren and Angela Alima O'Donnell, the poet fixed in my mind's eye is the immature image of a rangy, disheveled figure scrawling flowery verse on a tattered pad while seated against an oversized oak tree atop a grassy, windswept hill. The poet, in Hilaire Belloc's novel The Four Men, reinforces this depiction, saying, quote, "I'm not a man of action, but I am a man of dreams. I make the songs of the world. I make the poems that men read and speak, and in the making of them, I am free." Close quote. Now, to be sure, Ryan Wilson speaks of inspiration as instrumental in crafting sublime poetry, but he also speaks of discipline. To be an outstanding poet requires enormous technique. It demands the learning of thousands of lines by heart. As Ryan says, you shouldn't rest easy with what comes easy. Writing poetry expects a submission to the prospect that you, the poet, are the least important person, whereas the reader is the most important. It begs for unity in an age of fragments, hope in the midst of nihilism, transcendence in the face of finitude, memory in an era of forgetting. One of Ryan Wilson's many disciplines that I appreciate most is his patience. Out of long-standing custom, after crafting a poem, Ryan puts it in a drawer and waits. He waits for the emotions to cool, waits for the context to clarify, waits for relevance to bear itself out, waits for the right time. Now, Emily Dickinson stored her poems in a drawer, and Gerard Manley Hopkins likewise set his masterpieces aside. Both had the majority of their poems published posthumously after being discovered in obscure nooks and crannies by friends or loved ones. Robert Caro, the painstakingly meticulous biographer of Robert Moses and Lyndon B. Johnson, counseled this type of surety and forbearance, observing that truth takes time. And once long ago, Rainer Maria Rilke wrote emphatically, "Everything must come to term before it is born." In returning to his poems after the passage of time, Ryan Wilson reads them with new eyes. In his old work made new, Ryan discovers what Greek philosopher of change Heraclitus observed, quote, "A man who steps into the same river twice, and even a boy who steps into the same river twice, cannot step into the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." Close quote. To be sure, the crafting of poetry is not some militant, dispassionate exercise of the will. But inspiration, it seems, springs forth from the fertile ground of discipline. This is evident in the poems found in contemporary Catholic poetry and in the sublime works of Ryan Wilson. Returning to Hilaire Belloc's The Four Men, the poet notes this, quote, "We are all on a journey, wandering, seeking, and we do not know what we seek. But the poet, he sings as he goes, and in his song, he finds his way." Close quote. And one last thing. Find your favorite oversized armchair near a fiery hearth and enjoy Ryan Wilson and April Lindener's anthology, Contemporary Catholic Poetry. And while you're at it, read a few poems from Gerard Manley Hopkins and Emily Dickinson. See what ripened in the disciplined drawers of these masters, and how much better we are today for having ultimately shared in them. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.